It's been 2 years since I left that part of my life behind. 2 years since I loaded my pickup, slammed the door on a house that no longer felt like home, and drove out to the mountains of Colorado, searching for some kind of peace. I found it here, in a way. The quiet hum of a simple life has been my medicine. The snow-capped peaks my sanctuary. The days start early and end late, but I don't mind. I've rebuilt myself in the rhythm of hard work, working odd jobs in construction while helping a local rancher. And then there's Beverly. She's steady, grounded, so different from Hannah. Beverly was a fresh start when I desperately needed one. We've built something strong, something honest, something that feels right. After everything, it's almost unbelievable that I could have someone like her in my life. She knows about my past, of course, the way I left it all behind. The betrayal, the party, the things that happened that night I still can't fully process. I guess I should start there. Hannah and I were together for 6 years. It wasn't always bad. Actually, we had a pretty good thing going for a while. She was sharp, funny in a sarcastic way that matched mine. We understood each other in that. I worked at a tech company back in Kansas City, and she had her own thing going, working as an event planner for some big clients. We weren't struggling, but we weren't exactly rolling in it either. Looking back, maybe that's where the crack started. We got comfortable, but Hannah wasn't the type to settle for comfortable. She liked excitement, something I didn't catch onto until it was too late. She needed to be in the center of things, and I guess I was too caught up in work to notice how much she craved the attention. We started drifting. It wasn't any one big fight, just a series of small fractures that grew wider with time. And then there was him, Ethan. God, I hated Ethan from the moment I met him. He was one of those guys who came off too smooth, too put together. The kind of guy who shows up in a tailored suit to a casual dinner and makes everyone else feel like they've been underdressed their whole lives. Ethan worked with some of Hannah's clients, and I could tell he liked her from the start. He wasn't subtle. And it wasn't just that he was into her, it was the way he ignored me, dismissed me like I didn't even exist in his world. I'm not an insecure guy, but something about the way he looked at Hannah set me off. I told her once, in passing, that I didn't trust him. I didn't expect her to laugh it off the way she did, like I was being ridiculous. "You're jealous of Ethan?" "Please, David, you've got nothing to worry about," she said, rolling her eyes and walking out of the room. But I did worry. And not just about Ethan, but about Hannah. She'd been staying out later and later, always chalking it up to work events, meetings, parties. Her excuses made sense, but there was something in her voice, in her body language, that made my gut churn. I don't know, call it instinct, but I knew something was off. It wasn't until that night that everything fell apart. The night she went to Ethan's party. I didn't go with her. Hell, I didn't want to go anywhere near that guy's penthouse. She told me it was going to be a business thing. Nothing major, just a few drinks. "Don't wait up," she said, sliding her coat on as she headed out the door. I didn't wait up. I didn't want to, but I couldn't sleep either. Something gnawed at me, made my mind race with possibilities I didn't want to consider. What the hell was I doing? Was I just paranoid? Hours passed. Midnight came and went. By 2 a.m., I still hadn't heard from her. Then, the phone rang. Not Hannah, someone else. A voice I didn't recognize, but they knew me. They knew Hannah. I remember the moment like it was burned into my memory. The voice was slurred, drunk maybe, or something worse. They said Hannah had been with Ethan all night, and that she wasn't in a good way. They said she'd taken something or had something slipped to her, and I needed to come pick her up. By the time I got there, it was too late to save anything. The betrayal had already happened. The next part of the story isn't something I like to talk about. I try not to think about it, actually. But the image of Hannah, barely conscious, sprawled out on Ethan's couch, sticks with me no matter how much time has passed. She said she didn't remember what happened. She said she hadn't meant to take anything, that someone must have slipped something into her drink. But the damage was done. I wasn't even sure what hurt more, knowing she'd been taken advantage of, or knowing that she'd let herself be in that situation with him of all people. I couldn't look at her the same way after that night, and she knew it. I packed my bags a week later. But here I am, 2 years later, and just when I think I've buried it all, she shows up on my doorstep like a ghost from the past. It's been 2 years, but the moment I saw Hannah standing there, drenched in a Colorado downpour, I felt everything crash back into me: anger, sadness, betrayal. She hadn't changed much. Still beautiful, still with that haunted look in her eyes. But this wasn't the Hannah I remembered. This was someone worn down by regret. "I had to find you," she said, her voice trembling as I stood there, too stunned to invite her in. "What the hell are you doing here?" I finally managed, my voice colder than I meant it to be. "I need to talk to you. I need to explain." There it was, that look, that same pleading look she gave me the night I found her with Ethan, but 2 years had built up a wall inside me, and I wasn't sure I could let her tear it down, no matter how desperate she seemed. I didn't let her inside right away. We stood there, in the cold, with the rain coming down between us like a physical barrier. She shivered, and for a moment I almost gave in, almost let her walk through the threshold and back into my life. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the memories of that night, or maybe it was Beverly's voice in my head telling me that I had to protect myself. "David, please," Hannah whispered, looking up at me with those familiar blue eyes, now dimmed by whatever life had put her through since we last saw each other. I just need to talk." I stepped back. "Fine, but this doesn't mean anything, Hannah. I've moved on." She nodded, but I could see the flicker of hope in her eyes, like she thought maybe this would be her chance to explain, to win me back somehow. She stepped into the living room, shaking the rain off her coat, looking around like she was surprised at how different everything was. Well, of course it was different. My life was different, and she had no part in it anymore. I motioned toward the couch, talk and then leave. She didn't sit down right away. Instead, she stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable, until she finally turned to face me. "I didn't know how to find you," she started, her voice shaky. "You disappeared. David, you left without saying a word. I didn't owe you a goodbye," I shot back, maybe a little harsher than I intended, after what happened. I know. And I'm not here to make excuses," she interrupted quickly, stepping toward me. I need you to understand my side of things." I crossed my arms, leaning back against the wall. "Your side? There's a side where I'm not the one getting completely screwed over in this story." Her face twisted in pain at my words, and for a moment I almost regretted them. Almost. But I couldn't forget. No matter how much time had passed, no matter how many mornings I woke up next to Beverly, peaceful and safe in the knowledge that she would never betray me like that, I couldn't erase that part of me that had been torn apart the night I found Hannah with Ethan. "I didn't mean for any of it to happen," she said, her voice cracking. "That night, it was supposed to be work, just a work party." I scoffed, shaking my head. "You keep calling it just a party, Hannah. You know damn well it was more than that." Her eyes welled up with tears, but I wasn't ready to go easy on her yet. I had spent too many sleepless nights reliving every detail, every damn second of that night, to just let her brush it off. "I didn't know it would happen," she continued, ignoring my interruption. "I didn't know he'd be there." "Bullshit," I spat, pushing off the wall and pacing the room now, anger bubbling up inside me. "You knew he'd be there. You knew exactly who he was. You knew what he wanted." "I didn't," she stopped herself, her voice breaking as she wiped away a tear. "I didn't know how far it would go." There it was again, the excuse. The same excuse she used the night I confronted her. The same excuse I've heard 1,000 times in my head, echoing like a broken record. "I don't want to hear this again," I said, my voice low, trying to rein in the anger before it exploded. "You came all the way out here to rehash this? To make me relive that night?" She shook her head, finally sitting down, defeated. "No, I came because I need you to know the truth." "The truth? The truth is you chose him. You chose to go to that party. You chose to be with him. And I don't give a damn if you were drugged or whatever the hell you've convinced yourself happened. You let yourself be in that situation. That's all I need to know." Hannah didn't speak for a long moment. She just sat there, tears rolling down her cheeks, staring at the floor like she didn't know how to respond. Maybe she didn't. Maybe there was nothing left to say. I had heard it all before, hadn't I? But then she looked up at me, and something in her eyes shifted. "I didn't choose him," she whispered, her voice so soft I almost didn't catch it. "David, I didn't choose any of it. I was scared. I was trapped." "Trapped," I repeated, not sure if I was supposed to feel sympathy or rage at her words. "What the hell do you mean, trapped?" "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to get out." She shook her head, wiping away another tear. "Ethan, he wasn't who I thought he was. He wasn't just some guy who flirted with me at work. He wanted more. And when I tried to pull away, when I tried to stay away from him, he wouldn't let me." I stared at her, trying to make sense of what she was saying, but it didn't add up. It never added up with her. She always had some story, some excuse, and I was so damn tired of it. "You expect me to believe that you were some kind of victim in all this?" I asked, my voice rising in disbelief, "that you didn't have any control over what happened?" She looked down, her hands shaking in her lap. "I didn't have control, David, not that night." For the first time since she showed up, I felt something crack inside me. Maybe it was the way she said it, or maybe it was because I had spent 2 years trying to forget her, trying to hate her, but the way her voice trembled, it got to me. But I couldn't let her back in, not after everything. "You need to leave," I said, turning away from her. "This was a mistake. David, please, go." I heard her stand up, and for a moment, I thought she was going to fight me on it, plead with me to hear her out, but she didn't. She just gathered her coat, pulled it around her shoulders, and walked out into the rain, the door clicking shut behind her. I stood there, staring at the door for what felt like hours, replaying her words in my head. I didn't have control. What the hell was I supposed to do with that? I didn't sleep that night. After Hannah left, I just sat on the couch, staring at nothing, trying to shake the weight of her words. The rain pounded against the windows, relentless, matching the storm brewing in my head. I kept hearing her voice. I didn't have control. It sounded like another excuse, but there was something different this time, something in the way she said it. And it got to me. Against my better judgment, I found myself thinking about that night again, the one I'd tried so hard to bury. The night everything shattered. It was supposed to be a quiet Friday evening. I was wiped from a long week at work, ready to just relax, watch some mindless TV, and have a couple of beers. But Hannah had other plans. She'd been talking about this party for days, Ethan's party. I knew he'd be there, of course. It was his event, after all, and I knew she was going to go with or without me. She asked if I wanted to join her, but we both knew my answer. I didn't want anything to do with Ethan, didn't want to be in the same room as him. I trusted Hannah, or at least I tried to. But there was something about the way she talked about him that had been gnawing at me for months. She would bring up his name casually in conversation, laugh at his jokes, even invite him to a few of our dinners, much to my irritation. I could see it in his eyes every time he wanted her, and Hannah wasn't exactly pushing him away. That night, when she came downstairs, dressed in that sleek black dress I hadn't seen in years, I felt my stomach turn. She looked stunning. She always did when she put in the effort, but this time, it wasn't for me, it was for him. You sure you don't want to come? She asked, her voice light, as if this was just another night out. Nah, I replied, leaning against the kitchen counter with a beer in hand. Not my scene. She shrugged, like it didn't matter. All right, don't wait up. That should have been the first red flag, not the dress, not the casual tone in her voice, but the way she said don't wait up. She didn't say it with a hint of guilt or reassurance, just indifferent. I watched her leave, and as the door clicked shut behind her, something heavy settled in my chest. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being paranoid, but that sinking feeling wouldn't go away. Hours passed, and I found myself glancing at my phone every few minutes, hoping for a text, some kind of update, but nothing came. Midnight rolled around, then 1 a.m, then 2. By then, I knew something was wrong, something more than just my own suspicions. And then the call came. A number I didn't recognize flashed on my phone, and I almost didn't pick it up, thinking it was just a drunk dial or some telemarketer, but something told me to answer. David, a man's voice slurred on the other end. You need to come get her. My heart dropped. Who the hell is this? I'm a friend. Look, your wife's in a bad way, man. She's at Ethan's place, and she's messed up. My mind went blank. I barely remember grabbing my keys, throwing on a jacket, and racing through the empty streets toward Ethan's fancy downtown apartment. Everything blurred together, my thoughts racing faster than I could process. When I got to the building, I barely recognized the guy at the door who had called me, some drunk idiot in a rumpled suit, swaying on his feet. He pointed me toward the elevator without saying a word, and I didn't waste any time. I knew where to go. Ethan's penthouse was exactly as I expected, sleek, expensive, and soulless. But it wasn't the decor that grabbed my attention when I walked in, it was Hannah. She was sprawled on the couch, half-dressed, her black dress hiked up in a way that made my stomach turn. Her eyes were glazed over, barely focused, her head lolling to one side. Empty wine glasses and bottles littered the coffee table. And then there was Ethan, sitting across from her, looking as calm and collected as ever, sipping on some expensive whiskey like none of this was a big deal. What the fuck did you do to her? I barked, my voice louder than I intended as I rushed to Hannah's side. Ethan barely looked up, his expression unreadable. Relax, David, she's fine. Just had a little too much to drink. She's not fucking fine. I knelt down, shaking Hannah gently, trying to get her to focus. Hannah? Hannah, can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered, but there was no recognition, no clarity, just emptiness. I whipped around to face Ethan, my fists clenched, heart pounding in my chest. What did you give her? Ethan leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, perfectly composed. Nothing. She didn't take herself. She wanted to have a good time. Rage boiled inside me, my vision going red. I didn't give a damn about his smug face or his expensive penthouse. All I could think about was the way Hannah looked, the way she was barely even there. I stood up, my fists itching to land on his face. You fucking bastard. Ethan just smiled. That same condescending smirk I'd seen so many times before. You should be careful, David, you're overreacting. She's a grown woman. She made her own choices. I took a step toward him, ready to wipe that smug look off his face, but then I heard Hannah moan softly. and it stopped me cold. My focus snapped back to her. I needed to get her out of there, now. I scooped her up, wrapping her limp arms around my shoulders as she mumbled incoherently into my chest. She was a dead weight in my arms, and every step toward the door felt like I was dragging a piece of my life out of that apartment, one that I wasn't sure I could ever put back together. Ethan's voice followed me as I carried her out. Don't bother playing the hero, David, she's already made her choice. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I carried her down the elevator, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what the hell had just happened. When I got her home, she was barely coherent, mumbling something about not remembering. She cried, said she didn't know what had happened, that it wasn't her fault, that she would never hurt me like that. But I knew better. Better. That night, I put her to bed, but I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, staring at the walls, trying to convince myself that this wasn't the end, that I could fix it, that we could move past this. But deep down, I knew it was over. I had seen too much, felt too much. Ethan's words echoed in my head like a death sentence. She's already made her choice. And 2 years later, standing in my cabin in Colorado, I realized those words were still haunting me. Hannah had made her choice, and now, so had I. By the time I got Hannah into bed that night, my hands were shaking. I watched her, sprawled out and muttering incoherently in the dark, tears streaking her face. She was pleading with me, asking for forgiveness she didn't even understand. Her words were slurred, fragments of sentences that didn't make sense, and it crushed me. This wasn't the woman I'd married. This wasn't us. But it was too late to pretend anymore. I stood over her for a moment longer, then walked out of the room, shutting the door behind me. The house was silent, but it felt like the walls were closing in. I sat on the couch, staring at the floor, trying to wrap my head around what I had just witnessed. I wanted to believe her, to believe that she hadn't meant for any of it to happen, that she hadn't wanted to betray me. But no matter how many excuses I tried to feed myself, there was no denying what I'd seen. She had put herself in that position. She had gone to his party, gotten drunk or worse, and ended up in a situation that any sane person would have avoided. Maybe she hadn't planned on crossing the line, but she'd sure as hell danced right up to it. And Ethan, he was a predator, waiting for the exact moment she let her guard down. That much was clear. But who was I supposed to blame? Him for taking advantage of her, or her for letting herself get that close to him in the first place? I replayed the scene in my head, over and over, each time feeling a little more numb. The way she was slumped on that couch, the dress riding up her legs, her makeup smeared across her face, the way Ethan sat across from her, completely unaffected by the wreckage he'd caused. He didn't care. He never had. I was nothing to him, just an obstacle in his path to getting what he wanted. And Hannah, what the hell did she want? I couldn't tell anymore. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to drive back to Ethan's and beat him into the floor, but none of it would change the fact that, when I needed her to stay with me, she chose to stay with him. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, not even caring about the time anymore, and sat back down on the couch. The quiet of the house was suffocating. I needed noise, something to drown out the thoughts swirling in my head, but I couldn't even bring myself to turn on the TV. By the time the sun started to rise, I hadn't slept a wink. Hannah was still in bed, probably sleeping off whatever the hell had been in her system, while I sat in the living room, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of what had just happened sink in. This was it. This was the moment I'd been dreading for months, the moment when the cracks in our marriage finally split wide open, leaving no way to repair them. The next few days were a blur. Hannah woke up late the next morning, groggy and confused, not remembering much of what had happened. She apologized again and again, swore she hadn't meant for things to go that far. She said she didn't even know how she'd ended up in that state, that someone must have slipped something into her drink. Maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe someone had drugged her, and maybe she hadn't intended for things to get out of control, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done, the trust was broken. I tried to go on as if nothing had changed, but every time I looked at her, all I could see was that image of her on Ethan's couch, completely out of her mind, while he sat there, smug and untouchable. And then, a week later, I left. I didn't tell her where I was going or why. I didn't make some big, dramatic speech about why I couldn't do it anymore. I just packed a bag, got in my truck, and drove. I left Kansas City behind. I left the memories behind. I left her behind. I didn't look back. 2 years later, as I sat in my Colorado cabin, staring out into the dense pine trees that surrounded my home, I thought about that night again, not because I wanted to, but because Hannah's visit had dragged it all back up. Her words, her tears, her excuses, they had all wormed their way back into my head, despite my best efforts to push them aside. I didn't have control. Maybe she was right. Maybe Ethan had manipulated her, taken advantage of her vulnerability. But the fact remained she had put herself in that position. She had made the decision to go to that party, to drink, to flirt with a man she knew I despised. No matter how much I wanted to blame Ethan, I couldn't ignore the choices she had made leading up to that night. But what was I supposed to do now? Was I supposed to forgive her? Was I supposed to feel sorry for her? 2 years had passed, and I had worked so damn hard to move on, to rebuild my life without her. But here she was, standing in the ruins of what we once had, begging for a second chance. I couldn't give it to her. Not after everything. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows across the cabin, and I knew Beverly would be home soon. Beverly, the woman who had been my rock, my calm in the storm. She didn't ask much about my past, didn't pry into the details of what had happened with Hannah. She just accepted me, broken pieces and all. And now I had to figure out how to tell her about this visit, about the past that I'd thought I'd buried, but was now clawing its way back to the surface. I sighed, running a hand through my hair as the door creaked open. Beverly stepped inside, her smile soft and warm, but it faltered when she saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting down her bag and walking over to me, concern etched across her features. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to even begin, but Beverly had been by my side through worse. She deserved the truth. "Hannah was here," I said quietly, watching as her expression shifted from concern to surprise. "Here," Beverly repeated, her voice steady but guarded. "What did she want?" "And to explain," I replied, shaking my head. "To apologize. I don't know." Beverly nodded, sitting down beside me, her hand resting on mine. She didn't say anything, didn't press me for more details. She just waited, letting me work through the mess in my head. "She told me she didn't have control over what happened that night," I continued, my voice thick with the weight of it all, that Ethan, he wasn't who she thought he was. Beverly's grip on my hand tightened, but she remained silent, listening. "I don't know what to believe anymore," I admitted, my chest tightening. Part of me wants to think she's telling the truth, that maybe she really was manipulated, but another part of me, I just can't forget what I saw, what I felt. Beverly nodded slowly, her eyes soft with understanding. "You don't have to decide anything right now, David. This is your past, and you've been carrying it for a long time, but it doesn't have to define your future." Her words hit me hard, and I realized how right she was. I didn't owe Hannah anything, not forgiveness, not sympathy, not a second chance. I had built a new life, a better life, and I wasn't about to let the ghosts of the past tear that apart. I leaned in, pressing a kiss to Beverly's forehead, grateful for her steady presence. "Thank you," I whispered. She smiled up at me, her eyes filled with love and trust, and in that moment, I knew whatever demons I had to face, I wouldn't be facing them alone. I thought maybe Hannah showing up would be the worst of it, that after seeing her again, hearing her side of the story, I could close the door on the past once and for all. But life has a way of twisting the knife when you least expect it. You think you're done with something, that you've buried it deep enough, and then it claws its way back to the surface more vicious than ever. For the next few days, I couldn't get her words out of my head, the way she looked at me, the regret etched so deeply into her face. I wanted to let it go, wanted to focus on Beverly and the life we were building here in Colorado, but something inside me couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to the story. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was the part of me that still hadn't fully healed from the betrayal. It wasn't long before Beverly noticed. "You've been quiet," she said one evening as we sat on the porch, the sun dipping behind the mountains, casting the sky in shades of pink and orange. "Is it about Hannah?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of the conversation settle between us. Beverly had been patient with me, never pushing too hard, but I could tell she knew I wasn't fully present. "Yeah," I admitted. "It's been on my mind more than I'd like." She nodded, her expression understanding, but I could see the flicker of something else in her eyes, something like worry. "Do you want to talk about it?" I hesitated. I didn't want to bring this into our space, into the peace we had created together, but Beverly deserved more than me shutting down, pulling away because of some ghost from my past. She'd been through enough of that when we first started dating, and I wasn't about to fall into old patterns. "I can't shake the feeling that maybe there's more to what happened," I said finally, my voice low. "I don't know if I believe her, but part of me wonders if she was telling the truth about not having control." Beverly looked at me, her eyes soft but steady. "Do you think it would change anything, knowing the whole truth?" That was the question, wasn't it? Would it change anything? Would it undo the damage, erase the betrayal, if I knew she hadn't been fully responsible for what happened that night? I wasn't sure. But the not knowing was eating away at me like a splinter buried deep under my skin. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, "but I need to know." Beverly didn't flinch. She didn't get angry or jealous. She just took my hand in hers, her fingers warm against mine. "Then find out," she said softly. If it'll help you move forward, you need to do it. But don't let it pull you back into that place. Don't let it ruin what we have. I looked at her, grateful for the way she understood me better than I understood myself sometimes. Beverly was different from anyone I'd ever been with. She wasn't threatened by my past. She wasn't the type to feel insecure or doubt where we stood. But I could tell that even for her, this was difficult. I leaned in, pressing my lips to her forehead. I don't want to lose you, I murmured. You won't, she whispered back, her voice firm, but you need to make peace with this. She was right. I'd been running from the past for too long, and if I didn't confront it now, it would keep haunting me, no matter how far I tried to push it away. The next day, I decided to make the call. I didn't want to, but I needed to. There was only one person who could give me answers, and I hated the fact that I had to reach out to him, but there was no avoiding it. I found his number in my phone. Ethan, I'd never deleted it, though I hadn't looked at it in years. My fingers hovered over the screen, my stomach twisting in knots as I debated whether or not I should actually go through with this. But Beverly's words echoed in my mind. You need to make peace with this. I pressed the call button before I could talk myself out of it. It rang twice before he picked up, his voice just as smooth and self-assured as I remembered. Well, if it isn't David, he said, a hint of amusement in his tone. To what do I owe the pleasure? I clenched my jaw, already regretting this decision, but I forced myself to keep calm. I need to talk to you about that night. There was a pause, and I could almost hear the smirk in his voice when he responded. Which night would that be? You know exactly which night I'm talking about, I growled. The night with Hannah. The party. Ah, he said, his tone light, like we were talking about some trivial event. That night. What about it? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my anger in check. What happened, Ethan? What really happened? Did you drug her? He laughed, a low, condescending chuckle that made my blood boil. Drug her? Oh, come on, David, you give me too much credit. Hannah was plenty willing without any help. You're lying, I snapped, gripping the phone so hard I thought it might break. She said she didn't remember what happened, that she wasn't in control. Of course, she said that, he replied smoothly. What else is she supposed to say? That she wanted it, that she was just looking for an excuse to be with me. You think she's going to tell you the truth? I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, the casual cruelty in his voice. The way he twisted the knife, it was too much, but I couldn't hang up. I needed to know. Why, Ethan, I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Why did you do it? There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought maybe I'd struck a nerve, but when he spoke again, his voice was colder than before. Because I could, he said simply. Because she wanted it, and because I knew you wouldn't be able to handle it. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. He was playing me, just like he had played Hannah. This wasn't about the truth. This was about him getting off on the power he had over both of us. I had made a mistake calling him, thinking I could get anything real out of him. I'm done with you, I said through gritted teeth. Stay the hell out of my life. I ended the call before he could respond, throwing the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, falling to the floor. The screen cracked, but I didn't care. I was done. Done with Ethan, done with Hannah, done with all of it. I sat down heavily on the couch, running my hands through my hair, trying to steady my breathing. I had hoped for closure, for some kind of resolution, but all I got was more anger, more pain. Ethan was a monster, and Hannah had been caught in his web. Maybe she hadn't had control. Maybe she had, but in the end, it didn't matter. The damage was done, and there was no fixing it. The past was a wound that would never fully heal, but I couldn't let it define me anymore. I heard the door creak open, and Beverly stepped in, her eyes immediately locking onto mine. She didn't have to ask what had happened. She could see it in my face. Without a word, she walked over and sat beside me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders. I leaned into her, letting the warmth of her presence calm the storm inside me. I'm done with it, I whispered, more to myself than to her. I'm done with all of it. Beverly kissed the side of my head, her voice soft and steady. You've got me, David, we'll get through this together. And for the first time in a long time, I believed it. I'd like to say the call with Ethan was the end of it. That after that, I washed my hands of everything and moved on with my life, leaving all the mess behind. But life's never that clean, is it? The past has a way of sticking to you, clinging to your thoughts like mud you just can't scrub off. Even when you try to move forward, something pulls you back. For the next few days, Beverly could sense the tension I was carrying. I tried to shake it off, but it wasn't that simple. I couldn't stop replaying Ethan's voice in my head, the smug way he admitted to everything, the way he twisted the knife just to make sure I felt every bit of it. Because I could. The worst part, I still didn't know what to believe. Was Hannah telling the truth when she said she didn't remember anything? Or was Ethan right that she'd wanted it, that she'd known exactly what she was doing that night? I had all these questions, and no matter how many times I went over them, I couldn't find the answers. Maybe that's why I did the one thing I swore I'd never do again. I reached out to Hannah. It wasn't something I planned. Hell, I hadn't even been thinking about it when I picked up my phone. But one minute I was scrolling through old messages, and the next I was typing out a text I never thought I'd send. I need to see you. It was simple. Direct. I didn't want to get into a long conversation over the phone, didn't want to let her words manipulate me again. If I was going to get the truth, I needed to see it in her eyes. I needed to look at her face and see if there was any regret, any real remorse for what had happened. The response came almost instantly. Name a time and place. I didn't hesitate. I named a coffee shop on the edge of town, a quiet spot where tourists didn't usually go, far enough from the center of town that no one would notice us. Beverly knew about the meeting, of course. She did. We didn't keep secrets from each other. She didn't like the idea, but she didn't stop me either. She knew I needed to get this out of my system to find whatever closure I was still searching for. The day of the meeting, I felt like my nerves were shot. I didn't know what I was expecting. Maybe some kind of cathartic revelation, maybe some final piece of the puzzle that would make it all make sense. Or maybe just more of the same Hannah's tears, her excuses, her regret. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I walked in, the smell of fresh brewed coffee filling the air. I chose a booth near the back where we wouldn't be disturbed, and then I waited. She arrived 5 minutes later. I hadn't seen her up close since that night she showed up at my door, but this time was different. She wasn't soaked in rain, wasn't trembling with cold. She was calm, composed, but there was something fragile about her, like she was holding herself together with threads that could snap at any moment. "David," she said softly, as she slid into the booth across from me. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. I needed a moment to collect myself, to figure out how to approach this without letting my emotions take control. The last thing I wanted was to get sucked back into the chaos. We sat in silence for a few long moments, neither of us sure where to start. Finally, she broke the tension. "I didn't expect to hear from you," she said, her voice cautious, like she was testing the waters. "After everything." "I wasn't planning on it," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "but there are things I need to know, things I didn't get closure on." She bit her lip, her eyes lowering to the table for a second before she met my gaze again. "I'll answer whatever you need to know." I studied her face, looking for cracks, for any sign that she was lying, that she was playing me. But all I saw was exhaustion. A kind of weariness that comes from living with the consequences of your actions for too long. "Tell me the truth, Hannah," I said, leaning forward. "What really happened that night? No excuses, no sugarcoating. I need to hear it from you." She swallowed hard, her fingers twisting together on the table in front of her. I don't know how to explain it," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "It wasn't supposed to happen, David. I didn't go there thinking I was going to." "I'm not asking about what you thought would happen," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "I'm asking what did happen. The truth." She flinched slightly at my tone but didn't back down. "I was drunk," she admitted. "Way more than I should have been. I don't even remember how many drinks I had, but it was more than I could handle. I wasn't thinking straight. Ethan, he kept giving me drinks, kept pulling me aside, talking to me, and I don't know. At some point, things just blurred." Her voice cracked, and she paused, trying to collect herself before continuing. "I know I shouldn't have been there," she whispered. "I shouldn't have been with him. But I swear, David, I didn't want any of it to happen. I was out of my mind. I barely remember anything after a certain point." I leaned back in the booth, letting her words sink in. It was the same story she'd told me before, the same excuse she'd clung to since that night. But there was something different this time. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't trying to justify her actions. She was just broken. "And Ethan," I asked, my voice low, "what did he do? Did he?" She closed her eyes, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her face. "I don't know," she whispered. "I woke up at his place, and I don't know what happened between us. But I know he took advantage of the situation. I wasn't in any state to give consent." The anger I'd been holding on to for years flared up again, hot and suffocating. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that she was a victim in all of this. But a part of me still couldn't let go of the fact that she had put herself in that position, that she had crossed lines, even before that night. "You weren't in control," I muttered, more to myself than to her. She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "No, I wasn't." I stared at her, my mind spinning, trying to reconcile the woman sitting in front of me with the woman I had left behind. She looked so small, so fragile, like she was barely holding herself together. But I couldn't let myself fall back into the trap of feeling sorry for her. I had spent too long letting guilt and anger dictate my life. "You hurt me, Hannah," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "Whether you meant to or not, you hurt me in a way I don't think I'll ever fully recover from." She nodded, wiping her tears away with the back of her hand. "I know. And I'm sorry, David, I'm so sorry." For the first time, I believed her. I believed that she was genuinely sorry, that she wasn't just saying it to ease her own guilt. But it didn't change the past. It didn't undo the betrayal. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my head hanging low. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Hannah sniffled, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't expect you to. I didn't respond. There wasn't anything left to say. We both sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of everything we had been through pressing down on us. I didn't hate her anymore, but I also couldn't love her, not the way I once had. Too much had been broken. Eventually I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. Hannah looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, but she didn't protest. She knew this was goodbye. I hope you find peace, I said quietly, my voice steady but distant. She nodded, wiping her face with the sleeve of her jacket. You too, David. I left the coffee shop without looking back. The chapter with Hannah had finally closed, and as I stepped into the cool Colorado air, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: lightness. It was over. Finally, it was over. When I got home, Beverly was waiting for me. I walked through the door, feeling the warmth of our cabin envelop me, the smell of dinner cooking on the stove. She turned to look at me from the kitchen, her eyes searching my face for answers. It's done, I said simply, walking over to her and wrapping my arms around her waist. She leaned into me, her forehead resting against my chest. How do you feel? Lighter, I whispered. Like I can finally breathe. She smiled, her arms tightening around me. Good, you deserve that. For the first time in a long time, I felt like she was right. I did deserve peace. And as I held her close, I knew that this was my future, not the past I had left behind. As I stood there, holding Beverly in my arms, the weight of the last 2 years seemed to melt away. The tension, the anger, the questions I had carried, they all began to dissolve into something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. There was no grand epiphany, no sudden moment of clarity where everything became perfect. But for the first time, I felt like I could finally move forward without the past dragging me down. Beverly pulled back slightly, her eyes searching mine. So, it's really done, she asked softly, her voice full of both concern and hope. Yeah, I nodded. It's really done. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand everything that happened with Hannah, but I'm done letting it control me. Her smile was gentle, reassuring. I'm glad, David, you needed this. We stood there in the kitchen for a few more moments, just holding each other, the warmth of our home wrapping around us like a blanket. I could hear the quiet bubbling of the pot on the stove, smell the faint aroma of whatever Beverly had been cooking, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was present, fully present. The weight of my past with Hannah no longer had its claws in me. I had faced it, confronted it, and let it go. Whatever guilt or anger I had carried was no longer mine to bear. As the evening settled in, Beverly and I had dinner together, talking about the little things: work, the ranch, the plans we'd been making for the future. It was easy, natural, and everything felt lighter. There was no shadow hanging over us, no unspoken burden that needed to be dealt with. We cleaned up the kitchen together, laughing about how bad I was at loading the dishwasher, and then we stepped outside onto the porch. The air was crisp, the stars just starting to come out over the mountains. The peace of the Colorado wilderness surrounded us, and for the first time, I wasn't using it to hide from anything. It was simply where I wanted to be. You know, Beverly said, leaning against the railing, her eyes fixed on the horizon, we haven't talked much about the future. I glanced at her, curious. What do you mean? She smiled, turning toward me, her eyes warm. I mean, we've built this life together, but we've never really made plans, not long-term ones. I know you've been dealing with a lot from your past, but maybe it's time we start thinking about what we want next. I looked at her, and for the first time, the thought of the future didn't scare me. It didn't feel like some distant, abstract thing. It felt real, tangible, something I could reach out and touch. What do you want? I asked, genuinely curious. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Honestly, I want us to travel. I know we've been working on the ranch, building this life here, but I'd love to see more of the world with you. Just the two of us. Maybe hit the road for a few months, go somewhere completely new. The idea took me by surprise, but the more I thought about it, the more it felt right. We had spent so much time rooted in the quiet of Colorado, and while I loved it here, maybe it was time for something different, something just for us. I like that idea, I said, smiling at her. I like it a lot. She beamed, her eyes lighting up with excitement. Good then, let's do it. Let's start planning. It was a simple conversation, but it marked something bigger. For so long, my life had been about survival, about getting through the days, about dealing with the ghosts of my past. But now, standing there with Beverly, I realized I wanted more than just survival. I wanted to live, to really live, and I wanted to do it with her. We spent the next few hours on the porch, talking about all the places we could go, all the adventures we could have. It felt like a fresh start, a new beginning, and the weight that had been pressing on me for years had finally lifted. A few weeks passed, and the more we talked about the trip, the more real it became. Beverly was excited, her eyes lighting up every time we talked about hitting the road. She wanted to visit the national parks, see the coasts, explore places we'd never been before. I found myself getting swept up in her excitement, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had something to look forward to that wasn't just about escaping the past. One evening, as we sat on the porch with the sun setting behind the mountains, she turned to me, her voice soft. "Do you think you'll ever talk to Hannah again?" The question caught me off guard, but I didn't hesitate. "No, I've said everything I needed to say. There's nothing left between us." Beverly nodded, seeming satisfied with my answer. "Good, I'm glad you got closure. David, I really am." I reached for her hand, lacing my fingers through hers. "I wouldn't have been able to do it without you." She smiled, leaning into me, her head resting on my shoulder. "I think you would have figured it out eventually, but I'm glad I could be here with you." The sky darkened, and as we sat there, watching the stars blink into view, I realized something. The closure I'd been chasing for so long, it wasn't just about Hannah, it was about me. About finally letting go of the person I used to be, the anger, the pain, the hurt. It was about forgiving myself for holding on to it for so long. And now, sitting there with Beverly, I knew I could do that. I could let it all go. I didn't need to carry it with me anymore. "We'll start planning tomorrow," I said, breaking the comfortable silence, "for the trip." Beverly looked up at me, her eyes full of love. "You promise?" "I promise." The months that followed were some of the best I'd ever had. Beverly and I hit the road, leaving behind the quiet of Colorado for a while, exploring places I'd only ever seen in magazines or on TV. We hiked through canyons, camped under the stars, saw the ocean for the first time in years. It was everything I didn't know I needed. And through it all, Beverly was there, steady and strong, reminding me of the life I could have, one built on trust, on love, on something real. By the time we returned home, I felt like a new man. Or maybe I was the same man, but finally free from the chains of the past. Beverly and I stood on our porch, looking out over the mountains as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting everything in that familiar golden glow. "This feels right," I said quietly, my arm wrapped around her shoulders. She smiled, leaning into me. "Yeah, it does." We didn't need to say anything else. We had a life ahead of us, one full of adventure, of love, of hope, and for the first time, I was ready for it. The past was behind me, and now, finally, I was ready to embrace the future.